This planet of Earth has seen billions of people since its creation. Many will be unique in various ways. This video will show you 3 of the most unique people in history. The first such person is Solomon Shereshevsky. He was born in Russia, and often called a man who could not forget anything. He had a memory that was so perfect that he could recall every minute of his life in graphic detail. He also could feel images, taste colors, and smell sounds. He was born in 1886 and worked as a Soviet journalist and mnemonist. It started in April 1929. In the morning, his editor boss noticed that Shereshevsky had not taken any notes when the daily assignments were made. When he confronted Shereshevsky about this, the latter explained that he didn't need to write anything down, he simply remembered. This infuriated the editor, who picked up a newspaper and read at length from it, challenging Shereshevsky to repeat everything back to him. When Shereshevsky did so verbatim, the editor was astonished, and he sent him to Moscow's Academy of Communist Education for testing of his amazing skill. The researcher who met with Shereshevsky on that day was 27-year-old Alexander Luria, who brought fame to Shereshevsky. Luria conducted many psychological studies on him over 30 years. Luria began by reading off lists of numbers and having Shereshevsky repeat them from memory. As the lists got longer, even up to 70 numbers, and the tests became more complicated, Luria was increasingly surprised. Shereshevsky performed each test without error, and then, to Luria's amazement, he was able to recite everything backward. His memory capacity was virtually infinite. Not only was there no limit to what he could remember, but each memory was indelible. This means that 5, 10, or 15 years after memorizing a list of numbers, he could repeat the list perfectly, forward and backward, and describe in detail the room where the list was first memorized. Throughout his life, Shereshevsky was tasked with memorizing complex mathematical formulas, huge matrices, and even poems in foreign languages that he had never spoken before, all of which he would memorize with meticulous accuracy in a matter of minutes. I simply had to admit that the capacity of his memory had no distinct limits, Luria writes in his famous case study of Shereshevsky, The Mind of a Mnemonist, published in 1968 in both Russian and English. For all its vivid precision, Shereshevsky's memory had serious drawbacks. Since it was focused on concrete particulars, he had trouble identifying some things we take for granted. For example, he could not always recognize familiar faces or voices on the telephone, as, in his opinion, they changed too much. The subtle, trivial changes over shorter periods of time in someone's face or voice, that ordinary people are able to overlook, challenged Shereshevsky's power of recognition. As a person, he seemed a bit awkward, slow, and timid, perhaps due to the phenomenal flood of images flashing over his mind for recognition of faces, images, voices, and things in his mind at all times. Luria also found that Shereshevsky had an extremely strong version of synesthesia, in which the stimulation of one of his senses produced a reaction in every other. For example, if Shereshevsky heard a musical tone, he would immediately see it in color, touch would trigger his taste sensation, and so on for each of the senses. He used the images that his synesthesia produced to remember and memorize things. Shereshevsky also participated in experiments in which he showed that he had control over his body's involuntary, autonomic, functions. From a resting pulse of 70 to 72, he was able to shoot it up to 100, and again decrease it to a steady 64 to 66 pulse rate. When asked how he could do this, he replied that for an increase in pulse, he would either imagine himself running after a train that has just begun to pull out, or for a decreasing pulse rate, he would only imagine that he was lying in bed perfectly while trying to fall asleep. The most amazing feat was increasing and decreasing the temperature in his hands at the same time. Shereshevsky was also able to simultaneously raise the temperature of his right hand by 2 degrees while lowering the temperature of his left hand by 1.5 degrees. Once again, he stated that to do this, he simply imagined a situation in which his right hand was touching a hot stove while his left hand was grasping a cube of ice. Shereshevsky also claimed that he was able to avoid pain by just imagining that it was not him but someone else was experiencing it, and he was just watching the other man experience it. In the last few days, Shereshevsky tried to clear his memory by writing and burning memories on scraps of paper. It did not help him a lot. Therefore, Shereshevsky found a different kind of erasure in his final years, and that was drinking alcohol. Shereshevsky died in 1958 from complications related to his alcoholism. Luria wrote about him, "One would be hard put to say which was more real for him, the world of imagination in which he lived, or the world of reality in which he was but a temporary guest." The second unique person in history is Mihailo Tolotos. He was a man who lived for 82 years and died without ever seeing a woman in his whole life. He was from Greece, and only learned about the existence of women from peers, as well as through descriptions in books. He is claimed to have been born in 1856, but her mother passed away 4 hours after giving birth to him. Since no father or other family members came forward, the boy was abandoned on the steps of a monastery atop Mount Athos. He was adopted by the monastery. He lived by the strict rules in place in the area, one of which was that there were no women were allowed to enter there. Laws forbidding women and domestic animals, such as cows or sheep, from entering Mount Athos have existed since the 10th century Christian era and are still in force today. The reason behind this rule was to ensure that all the monks living in all the monasteries on Mount Athos could fulfill their requirement to stay celibate for their entire lives. He never left Mount Athos in his whole life. Tolotos died in 1938 at the age of 82. The monk was even given a special burial by all the monks living at Mount Athos, who believed that he was the only man in the world to have died without knowing what a woman looked like. The Edinburgh Daily Courier newspaper published news on October 29, 1938, that Tolotos had not only seen a woman in his life but also did not see an automobile, a movie, or an airplane. Today, Mount Athos is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and attracts thousands of visitors every year, many of whom are drawn to its rich history and spiritual traditions. However, women still cannot enter the area. The third unique person was Daniel Dunglas. Many consider him to be the greatest of all physical mediums. His phenomena were dramatic and varied, and although his career lasted approximately 25 years, he was never detected or caught in any fraud. Home was born on March 20, 1833, in Scotland, United Kingdom. He was a physical medium, and he had the ability to lift his body in the air and move around. He also had a reputation for speaking with the dead, rapping and knocking in houses at will, and moving heavy articles without any physical help. Since childhood, he displayed mysterious talents that crossed over the physical world. Home was adopted by his aunt, and he lived with her family. During childhood, he had a friend named Edwin, and they made a pact stating that if one or the other were to die, they would try to make contact after death. Home and his aunt soon moved to another place, and Home lost contact with Edwin until one night when Home saw him in a brightly lit vision standing at the foot of the bed, which gave Home the feeling that his friend was dead. Edwin made 3 circles in the air before disappearing, and a few days later, a letter arrived stating that Edwin had died of malignant dysentery 3 days before Home's vision. He is also reported to have foretold about his mother's death. When he was 18 years old, his aunt's house was reportedly disturbed by rapping and knocking. The noises did not stop and were attracting the unwanted attention of neighbors, so Home was told to leave the house. He stayed with a friend, and there he held his first séance in March 1851. The Hartford newspaper, managed by W.R. Hayden, reported that the table moved without anyone touching it and kept moving when Hayden physically tried to stop it. After the newspaper report, Home became well known in New England. His séances were attended by crowds of people and many well-known personalities, which included a Harvard professor, David Wells, and the poet and editor of the New York Evening Post, William Cullen Bryant. They were all convinced of Home's credibility and wrote to the Springfield Republican newspaper, stating that the room was well lit, full inspections were allowed, and said, "We know that we were not imposed upon nor deceived." It was also reported that at one of Home's demonstrations, 5 men of heavy build, with a combined weight of 850 pounds, sat on a table, but it still moved by itself. Home was investigated by numerous people, such as Professor Robert Hare, the inventor of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe, and John W. Edmonds, a trial court judge, who were skeptical initially, but later said they believed Home was not fraudulent. His seances were attended by academicians, scientists, writers, scholars, and notables of society. In August 1852, Home was reportedly seen to levitate twice and then rise to the ceiling, with louder rappings and knocking than ever before, more aggressive table movements, and the sounds of a ship at sea in a storm during his one show. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the famous character Sherlock Holmes, believed in the mediumship of Home. He stated that he was unusual as he had 4 different types of mediumship: direct voice, meaning the ability to let spirits audibly speak; trance speaker, meaning the ability to let spirits speak through him; clairvoyant, meaning the ability to see things that are out of view; and physical medium, meaning moving objects at a distance and levitation. Home held one demonstration in the home of his closest friend, Lord Alra, in 1868. In this gathering, Home levitated out of the 3rd-story window of one room, and came back in through the window of the adjoining room in front of 3 witnesses. His reputation spread throughout Europe, and Home quickly became an international celebrity and frequent guest of royalty. Among his acquaintances and admirers were France, Napoleon III, the German Emperor, the Queen of Holland, and many members of the Russian royal court. He held many seances in their courts and levitated tables, chairs, and other physical objects in the air without using any physical means during daylight. During his lifetime he manifested many feats which included raps, or knocking sounds, heard not just in the seance table, but in all parts of the room, including the ceiling. He could levitate and move objects including the heavy pianos and tables with several persons on top of it. He could tilt or move tables sharply, although objects on the table remained stationary. In his seances, partially or fully materialized beings used to appear from nowhere, and they used to touch, pull, pinch, and make other tactile phenomena with the hands of all present. In such gatherings, auditory phenomena, such as voices and sounds, and also music occurred without any instrument. People felt earthquake effects, during which the entire room and its contents rocked or trembled. In his presence accordion, guitar, or other musical instruments played untouched, and sometimes these instruments levitated in good light. Home retired from his work due to ill health, mostly due to the tuberculosis, from which he had suffered for much of his life. He died on June 21, 1886 at the age of 53 and was buried in Paris.